And domestication results from a number of different aspects. In the culture situation, there's essentially relentless selection because there's much higher survival. Genotypes that wouldn't survive in the wild can survive in the farm situation. As Andy Thomas already mentioned, farmers very often select for desirable traits in their farm stock, which again results in genetic changes. Often a small number of broodstock are used, which leads to random changes. And of course, the simplicity of the culture environment means that there are a lot of behavioural differences and particularly very little opportunity to learn about feeding and anti-predator behaviour and so forth. And all of these genetic and non-genetic changes mean that when farm trout are planted into the wild, they have very poor survival relative to the native fish. And they also have lowered reproductive success. So the overall fitness, the combination of the two, judged from experiments, is typically about 10% of wild trout. So only a small proportion of the stock fish are actually surviving. But say some are surviving, they're breeding, and more often, because of the numbers involved, they're interbreeding with the native wild fish. And this produces genetic changes. And there are three types of genetic change that we might consider. Now, although there is, of course, variation within farm strains contain only a small percentage of the genetic diversity that's present among wild populations. And so, if we put these farm strains into a lot of different populations, we're actually reducing the genetic variability among the wild populations. So if this particular gene here, this sort of orangey coloured gene as it shows here, if you put that into a lot of different populations, if the farm fish take over to some extent in these populations, you will lose part of the wild genetic diversity. So you have this genetic homogenization effect. The second aspect is a reduction in fitness. Now, some people have argued it's better to use diploid farm fish because they will breed, they will contribute to the population. That's fine. The problem is that in most cases they're interbreeding with the wild fish. And the hybrids between the wild fish and the farm fish have reduced fitness, typically only about half that of the wild fish. Again, that comes from experimental studies, not from any theoretical consideration. And so what you're doing through this interbreeding is lowering the fitness of the wild population. You're reducing the number of offspring that are produced. And of course, stocking is carried out on an annual basis, and so you have a cumulative reduction in fitness over time. And this comes to a point where the wild population is no longer capable of being self-sustaining. So in many respects, stocking is actually counterproductive. It is reducing the number of wild fish produced rather than actually adding to it. And Andy Thomas has already mentioned some of the ecological effects of sea trout production and their genetic effects as well, because as I mentioned earlier, becoming a sea trout has a strong genetic component. And experiments with both sea trout and with Atlantic salmon indicating that stocking with a farm trout could reduce the smolt output and the adult return. In a Danish study, they found that some smolts were produced by the stock farm fish, but no adults returned. But there was interbreeding between the freshwater component and the stock fish, again resulting in a switch towards more fish staying in the river. And experiments with farm salmon have shown that adding those fish to a wild population can reduce the smolt output and adult return by up to 40%. And there are several independent studies that come out with very similar figures. And of course, you have to consider trout are actually more domesticated than Atlantic salmon. They've been domesticated for well over 100 years compared with the relatively recent domestication of Atlantic salmon. And Atlantic salmon also has lower among population genetic diversity than trout. So trout will be more impacted than salmon will. And one question that really puzzles me, it puzzled me for a number of years. Talk to any angler, anyone involved with wild salmon, and they very readily, even the fish farm managers, accept that there is an adverse effect of escape farm salmon breeding with the wild salmon. But why then is it accepted that you can stock farm trout? The evidence for the two are exactly the same. If anything, the trout evidence is stronger. There have been more experiments done on that. Be interested to hear whether anyone can give me an answer to that question that has puzzled me for some time.
I'll tell you straight away, because people are more concerned about the anglers than they are about the rivers and the people and things that live in them.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that.
Yeah. Thanks. Again, as Andy mentioned, one of the arguments that constantly comes up is this belief that because stocking has been carried out for 100 years or more in many rivers, there's really no native genetic diversity left. Well, this is a pure belief. Nobody actually has ever presented any evidence to show that that is the case. Any of the people who make this contention certainly do it purely on the basis of belief and the assumption that because of the level of stocking there can be nothing left. But the current levels of genetic diversity, as we saw in the diagram earlier, even in England, argues against this. There's been no great homogenization of the genetic makeup. And quite a lot of direct studies have been carried out looking at individual waters throughout Europe to judge the impact of farm stocking on the genetic makeup. And in fact, there's some 50 studies. There are only 3 from Britain and Ireland, one on the Dove just down the road here. And genetic marker genes were used to determine the extent of the interbreeding. And in some interesting studies in Denmark, they were actually able to use scales that have been collected over the past 100 years, obtain DNA from those scales, and thus determine what the genetic composition was before stocking took place. Because most of the stocking in Denmark has actually been over the past 50 years. It doesn't have as long a history as here. So there is this ability to actually look back in time and determine what the changes have been as a result of stocking. An interesting thing is that over these 50 studies, there's been a remarkable similarity in what they found. One finding is that you really can't predict what the effect of stocking is on the genetic makeup. And that's not too surprising because you don't really, in most cases, know how many fish are in the population. You may know how many are in stock, but you don't know what the proportion is. And in some situations, in spite of a very extensive stocking history, there's virtually no farm genes detectable. Many stock systems show around 20 to 25% farm gene occurrence, and only a very small number of populations show more than 50% farm genes. So yes, there's an impact, but certainly no great wipeout of the natural genetic diversity. And again, some Danish studies, they actually estimated how many fish they had in the river before stocking. They knew the number that we put in, and then they looked at the number of offspring produced from the 2 different types.